Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening at the Science on the Sound series at the Coastal Studies Institute on the East Carolina University Outer Banks campus. This series basically brings scientists to you every third Thursday of the month. And those scientists address their research that deals with some sort of coastal topic. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Ferry, and I'm going to introduce him in just a minute. But before that, I just wanted to give some announcements. The next Science on the Sound series, I think I forgot to introduce myself. Sorry about that. I'm out of practice with this. My name is Lindsay Dubbs. I am a research associate professor at UNC Chapel Hill and here at the Coastal Studies Institute, and I work here. I'm very graciously hosted by CSI and ECU. So our next Science on the Sound will be next month, March 21st. And that Science on the Sound's title is North Carolina's Oyster Blueprint, and that presentation will be given by Aaron Fleckenstein from the North Carolina Coastal Federation. So make sure you make it to that presentation. It's sure to be a great one. And then we also have a wonderful opportunity for families on March 19th to do a program called Maritime Mysteries that is for school-age children and their parents or guardians, and that is from 3:30 to 5. And then finally, our open house will be on April 20th, and that is an opportunity for the community to come in to some of our labs, to hear more about the research going on here and at our partner universities, including East Carolina University. So please mark your calendar for all of those. And for those of you in the room, if you aren't on our mailing list, then there is a sign-up sheet in the back so that you can be notified of all of these events coming up. Okay, now it is time to introduce our esteemed speaker tonight, who we actually met at the open house last year. So we've been talking about him coming to give a presentation since then, I guess. So it's really nice to have you here finally. So Dr. Ferry obtained a PhD degree in microbiology and biochemistry from the University of Illinois in 1974. He was appointed assistant professor of microbiology at Virginia Tech in 1976, and there he rose to the rank of professor. In 1995, he moved to Science and Technology Experts Group. So as you can tell, he is a very esteemed scientist, and we're fortunate to have him here with us tonight. He's going to tell us about his research, and hopefully he will be extending that research here to the marshes of the Outer Banks soon.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that kind introduction. I'm excited to be here. I'm always excited to talk about life in the Salt Marsh Underground. So I'm pleased to see so many people here who apparently have interest in that, and I hope to generate even more interest as we go along. Okay, so here we have a very, can we turn those lights down a little bit to get a painting by Martin Heed of Salt Marsh, just north of Boston, near Newburyport, Massachusetts. And it shows some cattle grazing here on the marsh. Whoops. Okay. Some cattle grazing here on the marsh grass. In the background is the ocean. Some tidal canals here. This is a large haystack that then can be used to fodder the animals in the wintertime. Marsh grass is one of the fastest growing plants on the planet. 10 times more than tropical forests, for example, to give you some perspective. But this picture is not representative of life in the salt marsh. Below what you see here is a plethora of diverse beneficial microorganisms that are essential for the growth of the marsh grass by providing nutrients, cleansing the soil of pollutants. That it is, as I said, essential for the health and the growth of the marsh grass that you see here. Together, the life above and the fascinating life below that you will learn about in the next 30 or 40 minutes work together to impact even global ecology, as you will soon learn. So moving on, here's a graphical distribution of salt marshes in the world. At least half of the salt marshes that are depicted here by the red dots all over the world is mostly confined, about half of those salt marshes, to the United States and Australia. So, and you will see here on the east coast of the United States a very dense amount of salt marshes. And I'm just pointing out with this arrow the Outer Banks, where we are today. Why care about the salt marsh? Well, lots of ways. First of all, it provides shelter and food for nursery grounds for more than 75% of the commercial and recreational fish species, for example. It absorbs floodwaters. I'm sure you all have heard of this, wave energy, which decreases property damage by up to 20%. It provides habitats for birds, waterfowl, and imperiled species. It sequesters and stores the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide, as we will soon learn a little more detail about. And it does that at a rate 10 times that of mature tropical forests, as I had mentioned earlier. That moderates the effects of climate change and global warming. And then finally, filters pollutants that salt marshes need to help oyster reefs and seagrass beds. Lots of reasons for caring about the salt marsh. Okay, so this is a very bucolic, nostalgic representation of the salt marsh, but that's not reality. Since 1800, when Martin Heed painted this picture of the salt marsh, there have been great changes. There is, at least in the past 100 years since then, about half of the global salt marshes have disappeared, primarily due to development and sea level rises. And what is shown here is the dying salt marsh grass, below which there is these fascinating group of beneficial microorganisms that I mentioned to you earlier are so important for the health of the salt marsh that we're going to learn about in some more detail. Okay, so this is a little complicated, but I'm going to take you through it piece by piece, so at the end you'll have a perfect understanding of how carbon is transformed through the salt marsh. Carbon is in every living tissue, and so following the carbon is how scientists best can understand the salt marsh and changes that occur there. So I'll just orient you to this slide. Here we have high tide that floods the salt marsh grass. And down here we have low tide that exposes the face of the salt marsh. This is a profile, obviously. Marsh grass, as I said, is a very fast-growing plant. It absorbs carbon dioxide and through photosynthesis promotes growth from the atmosphere. And it dies and falls into the soil below that's represented by this blue area and the dying, decomposing marsh grass is called organic carbon. Scientists call this organic carbon. As I said, following carbon around is what's the most easiest and best way to understand transformations that occur there. Now this organic carbon is decomposed. marsh grass straw. And it occurs in two zones. One above this red line is the aerobic zone, so-called because the microorganisms that utilize the dying, decaying marsh grass utilize oxygen, just like we do. And they expire carbon dioxide, just like we do. And some of that carbon dioxide diffuses into the atmosphere where it is a potent greenhouse gas. Below this red line, there is very little oxygen diffusion from the atmosphere, and any oxygen that would remain is quickly consumed up here. So all this down here is anaerobic, what scientists call anaerobic, which means zones where there is no oxygen. And there are microorganisms that do not use oxygen, it's not present, but instead they breathe these molecules shown here: nitrate, manganese, iron, and sulfate. And the organic carbon that's metabolized by these anaerobic microorganisms is converted to bicarbonate. That's simply baking soda. Okay. And for the amount that is not metabolized by these breathing anaerobic microorganisms, there are bacteria, beneficial bacteria, that convert this organic carbon to methane gas. That's marsh gas, or swamp gas as known. So these two gases that are volatile, methane and carbon dioxide, escape to the atmosphere, where we all know are potent greenhouse gases. Methane is about 30 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in promoting the greenhouse effect. And although less methane is produced than carbon dioxide, because it's 30 times more powerful, it is about equal in promoting the greenhouse effect, equal to carbon dioxide. But some of the CO2, carbon dioxide, and the baking soda and the methane is also released during tidal fluxes at high and low tide, and is swept out to the surrounding waters, either the sound or the ocean. And there is also some undigested organic carbon that these bacteria do not metabolize, that also a process called carbon outwelling. So there is a dissolved inorganic carbon, that would be the baking soda. The dissolved organic carbon, which is the particulate decomposing marsh grass that has not been utilized by these bacteria. And then there's some more particulate organic carbon also. Okay, this carbon dioxide that's released here into the atmosphere is utilized again over here by the marsh grass. And so we have a sort of a carbon cycle where carbon dioxide is produced, some of which goes into the atmosphere, then it is taken up again by the marsh grass and so on in a cyclic fashion that I will spend a little more time on to detail for you scientifically. Okay, so here is a kind of a summary of what I just told you. So here is a profile of the salt marsh. You see up here dying salt marsh grass that enters into the soil profile below. And this little, so carbon dioxide is taken up through photosynthesis to grow more of the marsh grass. The dying grass that enters this little zone just underneath is decomposed to carbon dioxide by these bacteria that use oxygen, breathing oxygen, called aerobes, because they use oxygen. And then further down, when oxygen is depleted, we have this zone here of anaerobic microorganisms that breathe smaller molecules like sulfate to produce carbon dioxide and methane. If I can back up just a moment, I forgot to tell you about the microorganisms that breathe this molecule, sulfate. That's a sulfur atom bound to 4 oxygen atoms. Those microorganisms, those anaerobic microorganisms that utilize that, breathe the sulfate, but they exhale sulfide. Sulfide is a sulfur compound that gives marsh grass, or the marsh, a rotten egg smell. Okay. Just to bring some of these microbial transformations back to home for you. Okay, continuing on here, we have this anaerobic zone that these small molecule breathing anaerobic microorganisms in the absence of oxygen use to decompose the grass straw. But not all of it is decomposed. As I said, some of it is transported out during tidal flux, and some of it is buried further down in the soil profile where time and pressure turn that organic carbon that was marsh grass into peat that probably most of you have heard of. Peat is used, has been used in the past for a fuel for home use and farm use. Okay. Well, let's just back up here a moment to this slide again to make a point, probably the most important point I can during this lecture, and that is that as we have increased global warming due to these greenhouse gases that we're all familiar with now, that increases the temperature of the earth. Also increases the temperature of the soil profile below the marsh. And that encourages greater microbial activity, which destabilizes that soil profile here and causes an increase in erosion. And also, with higher sea levels, combined with this greater microbial activity that destabilizes the soil, enhances erosion of the salt marsh. So we have increased microbial activity that increases methane and carbon dioxide, that increases global warming, that increases microbial activity, that results in greater soil erosion. So as you can see, there's kind of a snowball effect here that's occurring. So it's not just that simple. It's much more complicated and much more serious consequences with global warming. And it all is key to the microbial activity here that destabilizes the soil profile of the marsh. Okay, and that snowball effect is kind of illustrated here in this slide. This is a slide of the east coast of the US, and what is shown is the annual mean percent carbon loss, which results in erosion. And in the northern climates, way up in Virginia, we have somewhere about 14% carbon loss annually, but as the temperature increases further south, you can see that the annual carbon loss due to erosion increases. This is due to the increase in temperature at the lower latitudes that increase the microbial activity, that destabilizes the soil profile, that then results in a greater rate of erosion and creating this snowball effect. There's about 80,000 acres in the US that's lost due to this snowball effect each year. And and probably will increase as we have increase in global warming. Okay, so I mentioned to you earlier that there's a kind of carbon cycle that occurs here in the salt. And what I'd like to do is address this in a little more detail for you to give you some greater understanding. And we will start here with primary production, which involves uptake of carbon dioxide by the marsh grass, which I'll just remind you is very fast growing. And then is dying salt marsh grass is deposited down here in the soil column. So that's depicted here in this diagram that we would develop the carbon cycle with. So in the aerobic zone, we have the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that through photosynthesis produces the marsh grass, which also produces oxygen in photosynthesis for us to breathe. So there's another benefit of the salt marsh. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are microorganisms there that utilize oxygen, as we do, to decompose the grass to carbon dioxide. So this is a kind of carbon cycle that occurs in the aerobic zone. But there are microorganisms down here in the anaerobic zone. So what happens down there precisely? Okay, so we'll start here with grass. What the blue arrows represent is the anaerobic zone. And these shaded red was what I just told you about, the aerobic zone. The grass is first metabolized by a group of microorganisms called fermentatives that ferment the grass to primarily acetic acid. Acetic acid is a molecule that gives vinegar its taste and also gives sourdough bread its taste. Okay, it's the same thing. As you probably have learned or are knowledgeable of, that there are many different kinds of fermentations, like for beer or wine and so on. This is the same process that occurs here in the salt marsh. There's a decomposition by these anaerobic microorganisms producing both carbon dioxide and acetic acid. But then there is another group that utilizes these products produced by the fermentative organisms, converting it to methane and carbon dioxide. But what happens to this methane? I've already told you that some of it escapes into the atmosphere where it is a very potent gas. And we know a lot about this process in converting this grass to vinegar and other molecules and this process of producing the methane. But we know little about what happens to this methane other than some of it escaping to the atmosphere. And it's an area of investigation now that's at the forefront of scientific inquiry. And this just represents some of the research that is addressing this question that showed there were very high methane concentrations in tidal marsh soils, salt marsh soils, but they ask in this publication about where does that methane go other than the atmosphere. And what they have shown is that, again, there's microorganisms below the grass that can eat and metabolize this methane. But we don't know who they are and how important they are. But we have clues based on my own research and the research of my students and postdocs, because we've learned in the last 3 or 4 years that methane-producing microorganisms can also consume methane under certain conditions. So one possibility is for this methane to be converted back to CO2 anaerobically in the anaerobic zone, devoid of oxygen, by methane-producing organisms functioning in reverse. But we also know from many studies over the years that there are methane-utilizing microorganisms that utilize oxygen in the aerobic zone that are also potential microbial sources of methane utilization. And this is important because it captures the great majority, according to recent research, converting it to carbon dioxide, which then is taken up again by the marsh grass in a carbon cycle. And that prevents that methane from reaching the atmosphere and exacerbating the so-called greenhouse effect and global warming. So we are really dependent on these bacteria to reduce the amount of methane that is coming into the atmosphere and causing this snowball effect that I mentioned earlier that involves an increase in global temperatures that in turn increase microbial activity that in turn destabilizes the soil profile and increases salt marsh erosion. Okay, so let me introduce some of these important microorganisms to you, all right? This one way over on the left, I have to show you because that's the anaerobe that breathes sulfate and produces sulfide, which is the molecule that gives the marsh its rotten egg smell. Okay. And I should point out, however, since I study methane formation, that methane is an odorless and colorless gas. So methane is not the culprit, it's sulfide. And these organisms here are organisms that work in a kind of symbiosis together to convert grass to this compound acetic acid, which is the component of vinegar that gives it its taste. And over here are some methane-producing microorganisms, and I'm particularly fond of this one. There are individual cells that grow in clumps. Maybe you can see them here. And this is the microorganism that my students have studied for almost 30 years now to understand all the biochemistry and molecular biology that occurs in converting acetic acid to methane. This is Methanosarcina viverans. Okay. Now, this process of the decomposition of organic matter to methane and carbon dioxide is not confined to the salt marsh. There are numerous environments in Earth's biosphere that are anaerobic, oxygen-free, where this process that I just described to you involving these fermentative organisms producing vinegar and methane-producing organisms that utilize acetic acid to produce methane and carbon dioxide. Some places where this process occurs, I'll point out. One is the rumen of cattle. Cows produce up to 100 liters a day of methane gas. There is the termite hindgut. It's smaller than a cow, but it's also more numerous. So it is an important source of methane to the atmosphere that promotes global sewage digesters. And rice paddies depicted over here. Marshes that we are discussing. And it occurs in the human large intestine. All humans produce some amount of methane, and that methane is absorbed into the bloodstream and then diffuses out in the lungs and can be detected in the breath. So if we were to measure methane in this room before you all came here, and we measured it at the end of this lecture, you can see a measurable increase in methane. So the process is going on at this very moment in this very room. Let me go back a moment here. Up in Grandy, there's a restaurant there, and that restaurant also has a filling station. And there's an advertisement on a billboard just before you get to it around Grandy that advertises their offerings on a billboard in a rather amusing and maybe fortunate combination. And that's what I was showing you on this on this slide. And I hope this will help you remember that there are many different environments in Earth's biosphere where this anaerobic decomposition of organic matter to methane and carbon dioxide exists. Okay, now another environment where this occurs is in freshwater marshes. Okay, we have out here kind of a brackish marsh that is somewhere between a freshwater and a salt marsh. And there's surely methane being produced out there, just beyond those windows. This is a video of ice that's trapped, of methane that's trapped beneath the ice of a freshwater marsh somewhere in Russia. I'm not sure where, but you will recognize the Russian language, perhaps, if you know. Okay. So these are all microorganisms decompose matter to methane and carbon dioxide, swamp gas.
Держи факел, держи факел. Кислей подбей. Тут аккуратно.
There's the methane coming up right there. That's a nice example.
Okay. Scientists have fun sometimes. Okay. So I hope this will impress upon you just the magnitude of these anaerobic environments on Earth that are producing methane. And again, I'll remind you that as global warming increases, that increases the microbial activity. And one example that has been on the news is tundra in the northern climates. Tundra is very rich in organic matter. And as the tundra melts, the microorganisms activate. And as the temperature increases, their activity goes up. And the rate of methane formation goes up. And again, we, through that process, again increase the global temperature, which then increases again microbial activity. So we have this very important snowball effect that's occurring, and these anaerobic microorganisms are key to this snowball effect that's exacerbating the global warming. This is not the only source of more recently, in the last few years, has been discovered massive methane deposits in the underneath the ocean sediments. And this is just showing some of the methane escaping from a fissure there. It's estimated that there's 3,000 times the amount of methane trapped in these sub-ocean sediments than is found currently in the atmosphere. The amount of methane that is released here and finds its way eventually to the atmosphere is still a matter of speculation. But one thing is for sure, there will be anaerobic and aerobic methane-utilizing organisms that consume this methane and prevent it from reaching the atmosphere. So again, we are very dependent on these microorganisms for both metabolizing organic carbon but also metabolizing the methane to keep it from reaching the atmosphere. Let me go back here a moment. I'm not sure I can activate that video, but I will try.
You can click on the, use the mouse on the computer.
You want to try that? We have a minute or two to do that. Okay, thank you.
Researchers in Sweden have discovered that large amounts of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas that is leaking from unusual depths of the Baltic Sea seabed. In a recent expedition, researchers at Stockholm University and Line University, detected methane bubbles rising up to 1,200 feet from the seabed, a stark contrast to the expected 150 to 200 meters. The gas bubbles were found in a 20 square kilometer area off Sweden's southeastern coast using advanced sonar.
So these are the gas bubbles that you see here.
And in this case, the gas bubbles
from release of the seabed.
The sonar also penetrates into the bottom sediments, which provides important information about the properties of the seabed. And for example, whether there is gas hidden in the sediments, it is then revealed by this sonar. Now, according to researchers, similar methane leaks could be present in other parts of the Baltic Sea. The researchers say they will be carrying out further analysis to understand the cause of high levels of methane release in that area. And if you remember, last year, ruptures in the Nord Stream pipeline under the Baltic Sea caused what is likely to be the biggest single release of methane ever recorded, according to the United Nations Environment Program. Methane gas is formed by microorganisms that live in the seabed's deep sediment layers. It is emitted
don't know why
into
they're
the
showing
atmosphere
this.
by leaks in fossil fuel installments,
agricultural
as well as from other human-caused sources
applications
like livestock
of
farming and
something,
landfills.
I don't know.
While it remains present in the
Has
atmosphere
nothing to
for a
do
shorter
with the
period,
methane.
when it comes to warming, methane is 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, and it is responsible for roughly 30% of the global rise in temperatures to date, even though it is far less abundant in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. WeOn is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the...
Okay, so I hope this impresses upon you the problem, or how methane is so important in creating global warming and how these snowball effects can occur. And that methane production occurs not only in the salt marsh, but in numerous other anaerobic environments. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
If y'all could use the mic as you answer your or ask your questions, that would be great, because then we have an online audience that can hear as well.
I'm very interested in the methane aspect of all of this. We have a similar thing in our watershed, phosphorus, that is bound in the soil and prevented from getting in large numbers in the groundwater by iron. I'm wondering, I know methane is fairly inert, but is there any way that methane can be encouraged to stay in the soil rather than bubble up into the atmosphere where it does much more damage?
Yes, that's a good question. There really is difficult to use a physical method to trap the methane there. But as I mentioned, I think the most important way that the methane could be prevented for release to the atmosphere would to be encourage or somehow encourage or introduce these methane utilizing organisms there. They may not be there, but they certainly, the environment certainly could be conditioned in order to encourage their growth, and they could be inoculated that way. I think that would be a very effective way to reduce the amount of methane.
Trouble is that methane is extremely volatile, and it's going to want to get into the atmosphere. The other question I have is these bacteria that seem to be important for changing methane to carbon dioxide again, which is much less harmful to the atmosphere. Are they affected at all by global warming?
Yes, they are. As the temperature increases, their activity increases. Absolutely, yep.
But they don't die.
No, they don't die. They're happy. They're very happy. They're happier with the increase in temperature. Yeah, absolutely. And their happiness translates to a greater rate of methane formation. Yeah.
So thanks for the presentation, and it kind of rings in because I was just up in Currituck doing some field work yesterday, and we're looking at some of the marshes up there and the erosion and actually collapse of the marsh, right? And so there's a couple spots up in the Pine Island Sanctuary that are essentially, submerging from the interior. And now just kind of thinking about, some of the microbes that you're kind of talking about, I'm wondering, is there, you mentioned sort of this hyperactivity, both on the methane side and sulfide producing, which is then also a poison for some of the vegetation. And is there a relationship there between its activity and the type of or speed at which they're eating that organic material, and does it limit then new vegetation coming in there, particularly in some of those areas that are getting submerged rather than eroded from the shoreline?
Okay, if I understand your question, you're asking whether or not the type of organic matter that's there could have an influence on methane formation, or the environment itself, the multiple environmental influences.
I would say maybe both, right? So the type of organic matter, depending on, because you mentioned, right, we're brackish marshes, and up there it really is that transition between fresh water and brackish water now. But then also thinking about, the water levels and things so the kind of that geomorphology or the environment that's there as well.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So you're asking basically how the environment, other than temperature, can influence methane formation. And yes, there are many environmental factors, one of which you mentioned, for example, flooding. Obviously, the more the soil is flooded, the less amount of oxygen can diffuse into the anaerobic zone. I didn't mention, but I should, that these anaerobic methane-producing organisms are poisoned by oxygen. So any process that would introduce oxygen into this zone would also prevent methane formation, but it would also prevent the decomposition. And what that and because there's a carbon cycle, and because the marsh grass needs carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, it's all out of balance if that happens. Another factor is salinity. So as we have a sea level rise, the soil profile becomes more saline because the sea level is saturating the soil profile. And the saline, the salt increase has a detrimental effect on microorganisms that have adapted to lower salinities. But on the other hand, nature is very resilient and adaptable. So it's likely that as the salinity, that there will be microorganisms evolving there that can tolerate that kind of salinity. So environmental factors do play a role, but you have to keep in mind that microorganisms are very adaptable. They mutate rapidly, and they can adapt rapidly to any environmental changes, but certainly not extreme ones, for example.
All right, now we have 2 questions from our online audience. The first is, are there additional experiments in addition to the Volta experiment that could be done to assess the presence of methane in the marsh?
Okay, the question is, are there any methods for determining the rates of methane formation and utilization? Is that correct?
Sure, that sounds like a good interpretation.
Okay, that's what I think you were saying. Yes, there are. Scientists use what are known as stable isotopes. So carbon atoms are really what we call a C12 carbon, but also in nature there's a carbon called C13 that's a little heavier. And that can be detected very sensitively by instruments, the instrument called a mass spectrometer, for example. And that method is used commonly to determine carbon cycling, including the cycling of methane. So there are other methods, numerous methods for evaluating the microbiology and the transformations of carbon atoms that occur there by these bacteria, beneficial bacteria.
And our second question is, one of our viewers would like to know, what type of marsh grass is the fastest growing?
What type of what?
What type of marsh grass is the fastest growing?
I didn't get the first.
The type of marsh grass.
Oh, the type of marsh grass. Oh, okay, thank you. Oh, the question is what type of marsh grass grows. There are with Spartina alterniflora, and this is a very prominent marsh grass that occurs especially
I'm not a scientist, I just want to preface that. But I was really interested in the bicarbonate production of the anaerobic organisms, because I understand that is an alkaline molecule and may have kind of effects on ocean water that are positive. Can you talk a little bit about that? And how it kind of fits into this cycle?
Yes. The bicarbonate is in equilibrium with carbon dioxide gas, okay? And I'm not familiar with the ratios of the bicarbonate, which you correctly identify as being an alkaline compound, and its conversion to carbon dioxide. I do know that there is a very important enzyme that catalyzes the conversion of bicarbonate to carbon dioxide, and that's prominent in microorganisms there in the salt marsh. So just what the proportion is of the alkaline bicarbonate and carbon dioxide, I'm not familiar with, but you make a good point that, that the bicarbonate could influence the pH of the soil, which in turn will influence the metabolism of microorganisms there.
So as the sea level rises and pushes inland, is it likely that it will create new marsh areas, or with all the factors that you talked about earlier, will that keep it from happening?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. There's a study on Plum Island that as sea level rises and there's carbon outflow, there's also, when the tide is coming in, can transport silt and other detritus on top of the marsh. So you actually have a building of the marsh during erosion that is occurring. So the marsh does recede, but it also increases in height. Okay, so the total mass of the marsh may be steady. Although you see some erosion at the face, you see some growth in the height.
Could you talk about the sulfide a little bit? And because that's an aerosol that goes into cloud formation, is it significant or not? And then also, I'm not a scientist, so could you explain the difference between, say, a prairie and a salt marsh? Is it water? Is that the significant ingredient that makes the...
Okay, I couldn't hear your question very well. Could you repeat the first one?
Okay, the sulfide.
A little louder. Is that on? Yeah.
I don't think it's on. This sulfide, and that's produced.
Oh, the sulfide.
That's an aerosol that contributes to cloud formation, right?
Yes.
Is it significant, or?
It is significant. The sulfide is a gas, and it does diffuse, but it's also a very heavy gas. And so it accumulates right at the surface of the marsh. And if there are depressions in the marsh, that sulfide can find its way and concentrate in those depressions. And there have been reports where people mining peat, for example, that I mentioned, come in contact with very high concentrations of the sulfide, which is very poisonous, and have succumbed to sulfide poisoning that way. Our nose is 10 times more sensitive than the most sensitive scientific instrument developed for sensing sulfide. So we have evolved as humans to avoid sulfide. We've evolved a way to measure just minute amount of sulfide in order to keep us safe.
We've got time for one more online question, and that is, could we capture methane from seeps?
Can we capture it?
Yes, sir.
We can, but that would require a very extensive engineering protocols that I think would be impractical, especially when you have large acreages of the marsh grass that we have. I will mention, however, that it has been proposed that to construct not instruments, but factories, so to speak, on a large scale that would draw methane out of the atmosphere, then to be concentrated and introduced to these microorganisms that consume methane, both aerobic with oxygen and anaerobic for reversal of production. It was recently published in a high-profile journal called the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. If the person asking the question would like to know more about that, they should try to access the article. The author of that article is Mary Lidstrom.
All right. Thank you so much. Dr. Ferry, thank you so much for coming out. And audience, thank you all for coming out as well. We hope you'll join us at some of our next events or upcoming lecture in March.